Hi, how you doing? In this video, we're going to talk about one of the weird paradoxes that holds HEMA back from any type of widespread acceptance in the martial arts community. Oh, and we have another sponsor, but more on them later. Now, before we get going, I know I'm going to upset and offend a fair few folk with this video. Like any form of recreational violence, there are always people who are so bought into the idea of it that any inferred criticism of what they do hits really hard, and they tend to take it very personally. If that's you, and your reaction to what I'm saying is to get angry, please bear in mind that I've been part of the HEMA community longer than you. Unless you're Bob Brooks. When I started, HEMA wasn't a name. That was something Matt Easton from Scholar Gladiatoria, a few other guys, and I came up with one hungover morning. And there certainly wasn't a community. The internet wasn't really a thing back then, and those of us working in HEMA were scrutinising terrible quality photocopies of old manuscripts, trying to figure them out. I've seen the hobby develop over several decades, and there are a few things that we can't ignore. There are probably a couple of other things I ought to say before I dive into it. HEMA isn't one thing, it's lots of different arts, blah blah blah. This is all just my opinion, and it's something I've been as guilty of as anyone. So, are we good now? Okay, so what is HEMA? Well, it's the attempt to study and recreate systems of combat that have either died out completely or have evolved beyond recognition. In effect, systems where there's no living lineage. We've no one to tell us what we're doing is right, we just have to figure it out ourselves. If it both fits the source material and also works, then we can consider it to be correct, or at least one possible version of correct. And that leads to a few problems. The first of which is that HEMA is first and foremost about research. It's about reading. It's about trying to understand other languages or archaic forms of your own language. It's about critically analysing written material in order to attempt to understand exactly what it's trying to say. Then it's about trying to take that interpretation of the text and make it work physically, to put it into practice. And this is where it tends to get a little bit difficult, because the sort of person who excels at the first part, the sort of person who's happy to try and fight their way through a handwritten manuscript from 600 years ago, written in an obscure dialect of a language that isn't necessarily even the one they naturally speak, the sort of person who can look at the nuances of each word and try and fit them against the background of the social context of the period, the sort of person that's already done this and has reference points of other manuscripts and other systems to use as a framework to base the whole thing in. That kind of person tends not to also be the kind of person who excels at the real-world application of physical violence. The sort of person who is both willing and able to put those physical instructions into practice. The sort of person who isn't going to be put off by getting it wrong, by failing and getting hit, whether it's by a sword, a staff, or a fist. The sort of person who's willing to push themselves physically, to take as much punishment as it takes to get it right, to simply have the strength, the speed, the endurance, to be able to put the physical work into the same level of detail they did with the academic work. And the fact that both of these sets of attributes are equally important is one of the reasons HEMA hasn't become a global phenomenon. Not that any of this is news to you if you're involved in the HEMA scene. You're fully aware of the two different extremes of HEMA and how they don't often mesh very well. You're probably also fully aware that the sort of person who does have both aspects to enough of a degree that they've managed a degree of success in HEMA tends to be a little bit arrogant. I don't mean that as an insult. I count myself in that group. This is one of the reasons that over the last 25 years there have been so many big fallings out online between groups and group leaders about their interpretations. None of us are willing to concede an inch, not when it actually comes down to it. But none of that is the main issue I wanted to talk about. That's simply the context. I'm going to go off on a tangent now.
Oh, there's a big surprise!
And hopefully in a little while you'll realise it wasn't actually that much of a tangent at all. I started off my martial arts career in Aikido as a kid. I moved into Shotokan and after about 8 years gave that up to focus on HEMA. That was back in the 90s because I'm horribly old. Despite focusing primarily on medieval sword and buckler and then Elizabethan backsword, I always had a hankering to do more unarmed stuff. I got into classical pugilism and through that into obscure forms of folk wrestling. Cornish, and Cumberland and Westmoreland. I found a few people who claimed some experience and I learned what I could from them. But like with most of HEMA, I was basing my practice mainly on source material. I'd moved on from photocopies of manuscripts to high-resolution scans of books, and a few original books themselves. I'd recruited a small group of people who shared my love of the up-close and personal stuff, and we spent a ridiculous amount of time hitting each other in the face, trying to make the throes described in these old books work. Then by chance, I discovered that one of the old-timers who'd done this sort of stuff as a kid was still teaching it now. That was Billy Robinson. And he was coming back to the UK. I could go and learn from him. So I drove hundreds of miles and I took the first few steps into what was going to prove to be a very different world indeed. In the space of a few short hours, my entire frame of reference for martial arts changed beyond recognition. I felt completely out of my depth, utterly physically incompetent, and if I'm being completely honest, more than just a little bit scared. I'd come to catch-as-catch-can wrestling from HEMA. In my world, I was at the very top of the tree. There was almost no one in the world I wasn't happy to face with a sword in my hand. Possibly only 2 or 3 people I wasn't confident I could beat. I was one of the best in the world at classical pugilism. I was one of a tiny group of people actually doing this stuff live, and not just in a theoretical way. And yet despite this, and despite all my years of Japanese martial arts beforehand, I was shit. I guess there are 2 directions a person can go when they reach a point like this in their lives. Most of us would simply let the cognitive dissonance kick in, accept that this new thing isn't for them, and then go back to being the big fish in the tiny pond. But for me, it felt a little bit like I'd finally had my eyes opened, and I couldn't go back. Which is why some 12 or 13 years later, I'm an assistant coach for scientific wrestling. I regularly train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and in reality, I'm not really involved in the HEMA scene at all anymore. So how is this delightful little anecdote relevant? Well, we need to understand why it is that I'm not really part of the HEMA scene. Because that explains exactly what I said we were going to talk about right at the beginning of this video. We're going to talk about one of the weird paradoxes that holds HEMA back from any type of widespread acceptance in the martial arts community. You see, there's an inherent distrust within the HEMA community of people who do modern styles of fighting. We don't mind them, but when they come into our world, it's like they're simply doing what they already do and dressing it up as HEMA. You see it with modern sports fencers, who come in with their impeccable timing and explosive footwork, and run roughshod over whole swathes of tournament fighters. You see it with boxers hitting classical pugilists at will, and you see it with wrestlers and jiu-jitsu fighters playing with HEMA grapplers as if they were kids. Clearly what they're doing isn't HEMA, because what we're doing is HEMA and they're beating us. They must just be doing modern stuff. I mean, in some cases that's actually true. I've seen sports fencers pick up a training sword for the first time and beat experienced HEMA fighters without even pretending they're doing anything other than epee. But in some cases, those years of training and practicing and fighting just give you a better understanding of the mechanics of the technique. They give you real insight into how to apply techniques. They make you better at HEMA. But because these people get this extra ability from sport and not from reading dusty old books, it can't be valid, right? I mean, I was as bad as anyone. But then I started finding myself on the receiving end of this. I was spending so much time on the M of HEMA that all the time I'd spent on the H was considered invalid. It wasn't necessarily that I was specifically pushed out of the community, but rather that the better I got at actually fighting, the less relevant what I was doing was treated by the community at large. Now I have to say that this is a massive generalisation, and there are definitely groups of people out there who this simply isn't true of. I'm thinking of the Noble Science crew first and foremost. But the issue is real, and in reality I'm not sure how to change it. More sadly, I'm not sure if I want to put in the effort it's going to need in order to make the attempt. In reality, I'm probably just going to keep putting that time into training myself and coaching the people in my catch wrestling class. I'm not walking away. I'm really happy to come to you and run a session if you're interested in seeing a historical European martial art. So damned effective it'll blow your mind. I'll come for a while and run several days of dedicated training for you if you want. deep down, I still want to spread this amazing system as widely as I possibly can. I don't think the late great Billy Robinson would ever forgive me if I didn't. And that brings me nicely onto this video's sponsor. This video is kindly sponsored by Scientific Wrestling. I'm not going to go into much detail here, as I've already explained exactly how incredible the training they offer is, and how getting involved with first one and then many more of their training camps literally changed my life. But if you want to learn a genuinely effective historical European martial art and become part of the most famous and prestigious combat lineage in the world, back through Billy Robinson to Billy Riley's gym and beyond, back to the American carnival wrestlers like Dick Cardinal and August Sepp, this is your chance. If you want to train under coaches like Wade Shallers, the greatest pinning wrestler ever, I mean, genuinely, the greatest pinning wrestler ever in the history of wrestling. People like Josh Barnett, the youngest ever heavyweight UFC champion, King Mo, former Strikeforce and Rise-In champion, and one of the few people to defeat Roger Gracie, then you can. If you go to scientificwrestling.com, link in the description obviously, and use the discount code English Martial Arts, then you'll get 10% off, not just the training camps, but everything on the site. But, I can't recommend the training camps enough. I really can't. They're hosted all across the US, in the UK, and I think Italy as well. So, thank you Scientific Wrestling for sponsoring this video. If you do go, let me know. I'd love to know if it changes your life the way it changed mine. And to those of you still here at the end of the video, fight team!